Welcome back to the program. Thank you, as always, for joining into this experience. We are going to do something a little bit different today. A few episodes ago, I outlined some ideas for where we're headed with this podcast, and obviously it's still going to be a lot about work, and the subtitle of this Insubordinate podcast is Better Workplaces, Better World. But there is an element of the better world piece that I feel like we could get farther into. I feel like there are things that we could discuss, things that could come up that have ramifications for our work life, but are part of a larger picture, part of a larger whole. And one of those things is mental health and our collective experiences, the family we grew up in, the vows, the promises, the decisions that we make, the kind of person that we aspire to be, in part because of our experiences and in part because of our upbringing. And all of those things bleed into every area of our lives, including work. And I had an experience in the very recent past, within the last month, of having told a story as a part of a storytelling event that I'd never told before, and I'd never told in a narrative way before. So some listeners of this podcast, and maybe I've mentioned this in a previous episode or something like that, but my father passed away when I was very young. And so I told a story about what I recollect from that morning, as well as the journey that I've taken since. And in the moments since then, I've realized how much of that has affected not only my life, that part of it has been plain from the very beginning, but my career and the decisions that I've taken in my career and how that has played out over time because of the way that those events and my response to them have shaped me. And so I want to get into that a little bit, and I want to share that story with you because I think there is sometimes more to this than just the straight, direct line to this is how you would apply it in a workplace or something like that. And honestly, I'm always going to land in that place. I am a practitioner through and through. I want things to be practical for people I work with, for my clients, for people who listen to this podcast. I want there to be some sort of application, something that you can take and make your own, and also to action and make your life better and the lives of people around you better. And if it doesn't have that, then we're just really talking and banting around ideas, which to me has some value, but not as much value as the really practical, how do we land this? Is this grounded in some measure of research or purpose or practicality? I want to go there in this space, and I'll talk a little bit about why this has something to do with work and why I wanted to take this particular episode in this direction at the end. But in essence, the majority of, or I guess the substance of this episode is going to be this story. And I want to give a warning ahead of time because this story references self-harm. It makes reference to domestic abuse, domestic violence, as well as drug use and drug addiction. And so I want to invite you to care well for yourself as you're listening to this podcast, or electing not to listen to it, or fast forwarding through parts of it, whatever that might be. Nothing that I'm going to say is explicit, but I know that there are many people who might be listening to this podcast and many people out there who have had experiences with these kinds of things that have been very traumatic. And I don't wish to create an environment or a situation where you're reliving that in a way that wouldn't be healthy for you. So please care well for yourself in these moments. I gave that expression at the very beginning of the story that I told as well. And it was a small audience of people, many of whom I knew, many of whom I invited to come and support me for the 10 minutes or so that I was given to tell the story. And some of you who were there probably are listening to this podcast now, and let me reiterate my thanks for the support that you lended and the presence that you lended and the space that you created for me in those moments. It was very healthy for me. It was very It was very difficult for me, but it was also a very healthy thing to be able to do. And I was glad to have finished it and then be able to land in spaces where I had familiar faces and people who I knew cared about me and who were there just because they wanted to hear that story. And even though they knew that story, wanted to make space for the fact that I had told it, and understanding that the emotion and the difficulty with which I managed to do that was going to require being surrounded by my friends and my family as well. My wife was there, and so were both of my kids, which ironically made it a lot more difficult in some ways. I was very glad for them to be there, but it made it a lot more difficult. And part of the reason why is because they have been my inspiration and my motivation for who I've become and how I became it for literally as long as I can remember. And also, they were the subject of so much of what I talked about, even indirectly. And I think you'll hear that as I tell the story, as I read the story. I'm just going to read the script that I prepared when I did the story a few weeks ago. I had it memorized, and I brought my iPad with me because I knew there were going to be points where I probably got lost or felt less control over my emotions and wouldn't be able to remember what was next. And those moments of emotion came for sure, but they thankfully didn't make it so that I needed to reference too many times what I had written down. But I wanted to just read that through for you. And so I invite you into the experience of the story that I've had and the decisions that I've made as a result. And I hope that will find some measure of resonance for you in terms of maybe not necessarily having something similar in your world, but maybe something parallel. Maybe something that you have experienced that has shaped you in ways that you have done the work around and figured out, and moves you into certain kinds of decisions or certain ways of feeling or certain ways of behaving that have benefited you and the people around you. And if not, then perhaps it will encourage you to investigate that a little bit further and to think more about what that looks like and how that manifests itself in your spheres of influence. This is the story that I told about the morning that my father passed away. Wake up. My aunt's voice roused me into consciousness. You need to get dressed now. Her parental tone did not match the urgency and anxiety I saw in her countenance. It was August 2nd, 1979. As she moved to wake my younger sisters, I knew something was wrong. Suddenly on this morning, I knew I needed to protect them, to help them. Already I felt the change I would much later describe as having gone to sleep in a child's world, if indeed I had ever resided there, and awakened in an adult's. It was August 2nd, 1979. So many other children, I was obsessed with emergency vehicles. Their flashing lights and sirens captivated me. I'd watched them from my window dozens of times as they sped by on their way to provide help or rescue. But today the red and blue lights reflected throughout the bedroom I shared with my two sisters. The view from my window confirmed what my young intuition already knew somehow. Today, the emergency is at my house. It was August 2nd, 1979. My precocious 5-year-old mind wanted answers, but my aunt did not respond to my many questions. I felt annoyed, minimized. I felt that something seismic was happening. She knew what it was, and she wouldn't tell me. Many years later, as I returned so many times to these moments, I realized a place of great compassion for my aunt. Knowing the answer to a little boy's persistent questions, yet having to hold a terrible secret because it was not hers to reveal. It was August 2nd, 1979. My father was a man given to extremes. His journals are effusive with love for people and things in his life, and yet he was a violent man who taught me when I was 5 years old that the left hand is more effective than the right because most people are right-handed and expect punches to come from that side. He once hit my mom, a fact I didn't learn until I was an adult, and I once watched him punch through a plate glass window to unlatch a door when my mom wouldn't let him return to the house. Just after entering, he kneeled with his arms outstretched, beckoning his children to come to him. I saw the look of pain in his face as I hid behind my mother's leg, afraid of him. He suffered with a heroin addiction, And some of my earliest memories are of traveling to the methadone clinic where he received his doses and went to a support group. I played in the oversized closet there with a toy car given to me by one of the other participants. I still have it. On August 2nd, 1979, the day he completed suicide in our home, my father was 31 years old. My mother was 24 years old. I was 5 years old. My younger sister was 3 years old, and my youngest sister was 3 weeks shy of her first birthday. My mother had never worked full-time before that day. In the years that followed, she left our home before I awoke and returned long after I had finished school. I don't remember a single time when our family of 4 sat down to dinner together in our home. But my mom was my first heroine. Every measure of odds and statistics said we weren't going to make it, but she never allowed for that option. You'll pardon my expressing it this way, but if there's a list somewhere of all-time badass motherfuckers, she's on it, and her name is in bold, all capital letters. After that day, almost nothing in our lives was easy, even average. But she did everything in her power to ensure we were going to make it. She got the right help. She wrote the rest of the story. But we almost never talked about what had happened to us. It was not until years later, during my undergraduate experience, that I began to unpack having been part brother and part father, part son and part husband. And surviving the impact of that tidal wave took many long walks by myself, writing many bad poems, and many long sessions with Pearl Jam playing so loudly on a Walkman that the rest of the world didn't exist. It took a lot of work to acknowledge that I wasn't supposed to be some of those things, but I was given a crown by a king who hadn't been able to wear it rightly, and I did what I could in the years before I left home. It was less than I wanted and less than I'd hoped. It took me many more years after that, and still more support, to come to a place of acceptance, forgiveness, and grace, both for myself and for my father. I will forever be indebted to people who loved me well during those years, and devoted to the faith that emerged from them. Today is June 22nd, 2024. 3 days ago, Tammy and I celebrated our 26th anniversary. On a few occasions over the years, our anniversary and Father's Day have fallen on the same day. That, among so many other things, has healed me. I've wanted to forge the life I have now for almost as long as I can remember. And more than anyone else, she has made that possible. Our children are all but grown. I wrote poems for each of them shortly after they were born. In them are echoes of yearnings I have had ever since I woke up in that adult world all those years ago. 5 lines they share. As surely as there is a God to help me, the one I long for you to know, the pain that I have known, you will never know. I promise. The grief of losing my father when I was very young still visits me in different guises. In early years, it elicited anger and solitude. Later, it invited forgiveness, then compassion. Several years ago, I wrote these words, assuming they would find the familiar mark of forgiveness and compassion I had sought to practice for so long. But I was surprised, and something more lay beneath. It comes when I expect it, and when I least expect it. It has marked me now, the loss. I know its touch, I hear its voice. It settles with me, ignored at times for some distraction, though not forgotten. For far too bright, the light of my current life shines, making plain my shadow, a reminder to my heart of how I would have loved you, how I would have basked in the light of your prime, and of what I would have given to have your life, a shield from mine, to walk your steps from just behind, to see your way, to know your time, and how you would have beamed with pride at the toils and trophies of my life, and how I would have loved your smile, yearned for it with all my might. I would have been your prince. I would have seen you king, and my children, the glory of your line, so many apples for your eyes. And were our lives not filled with happier times, and if golden memory failed to shine, eclipsed by the reality of something less fine, still you would be enough for me. I think so, though I do not know. I did not know. I will not know. And maybe you were prescient, and maybe I, naive, how I wanted to believe. I have forgiven myself only moments, and lonely moments conceive. The reign of an ill-fitted crown, bequeathed before discovered means, worn askew, but I have straightened it for you. In spite of everything, it honors you. I honor you. Today's June 22nd, 2024. More than 4 decades since August 2nd, 1979. That little boy who awoke in an adult's world, holding a crown that didn't fit his father and didn't yet fit him, made so many vows, so many promises. I've kept them over decades of wounding and mending, of walking toward pain and into darkness, of persevering and building, and that has made me a gentle healer, a fierce defender, and an insistent encourager. Today I would have you know that all I have become, all that I am, is gathered and intended, aligned, on your side, whether I have known you this hour or a lifetime. And if any gift my experience, presence, or influence allows would afford you the momentum of safety, encouragement, belief, confidence, or anything else, even for a moment, then I would see you have it. Please ask. I'm easy to find. But maybe wait 15 minutes, because I'm probably going to need some hugs and a few words of encouragement after this. I needed to end that with some sort of disclaimer, but also a little bit of humor. During the session, I could hear people in the audience, although I couldn't see them because the lights were shining on the stage. But I could hear people in the audience crying. And it was strange because it felt normal and it felt like the natural reaction to this space, and that those people were with me and experiencing whatever it was in their lives that they needed to experience in those moments. And it also felt distracting in a way that I didn't really expect that to be the case walking up. I didn't expect, I wasn't thinking about that prospect when I walked up to tell this story. And obviously through the reading of the story, I didn't have the same level of emotion that I had when I was telling the story and walking over to where my kids were sitting when I was reading the words of the poem that I had written to them, and looking at them when I did that was not an easy thing to do. And I broke down in the middle of that because it was the first time I'd ever said those things out loud to them. And they have those poems, they have the written account of that. It's in frames that I gave them when they were very young, but I'd never read it out loud to them. I never said it out loud to them. And that ending bit was both for myself and my own kind of self-preservation and needing a place to land, but also for the rest of the room, I think. I've elected to share that because I think that making a better world involves work, but it also involves the shared humanity of we all experience very difficult things. The common denominator of human life many times is tragedy. And we all experience different tragedies, but we have that in common, and the wounds we carry as a result of those. And we bring those with us to wherever we go, sometimes overtly and sometimes not. But that has made my philosophy about organizational development and about people and how we should manage and lead them, it has formed that and informed that, because you've heard me say before, I don't think that we change who we are just because we went to work. I think that I've shown up to work every single day of my life as a person who has experienced all of the things that I've experienced, and some of the major things that I've experienced, like having a father who died by suicide in my home when I was a child, and taking on roles that were never meant for me throughout my growing up and into the time when I was in college, and then going to college and basically falling apart for a year and a half because I needed to make sense of all of those things. All those things are part of who I am and have formed an identity that says, this is how I will approach everything else. This is how I will approach my family. This is how I will approach my community. This is how I will approach my friendships. This is how I will approach my career, my workplace. This is how I will approach leading others, managing people. And I think we all have that. And so to be in touch with it is not only practical in terms of understanding the why behind some of the things that we do and why we do them, but also can be healing for us. And it can create spaces where those kinds of relationships can exist, because unless we're brave enough to talk about the things that we've experienced and the things that affect us and the reasons why, then we will never have a community that can share that with us. Whether that is because we need support, or because we can provide support to others, or because the shared commonality, the speaking things out loud, is different than writing them down. I learned through this experience that writing things down and speaking them out loud are very different. I've spoken out loud about my father's suicide and my experience in it, and I've done that in very matter-of-fact ways. And I've written about it. It's part of the book that I published 10 years ago or so. And writing that down and then reading it as a more narrative account in the presence of people that I knew and some people that I didn't know was a very different experience. So those environments are important. And I think work can be one of those environments. And I don't want to get too far down the rabbit hole of whether work should be family or all of those other kinds of things. I think we force that too much sometimes. But there are people in your life probably, and there are definitely people in my life who have become very good friends who I met because of work. And those are people who I would trust with the story and trust with caring for my experiences and my emotions. And I never would have known them if it hadn't been for work. And I never would have known those kinds of things about them, nor vice versa, had we not taken the courageous step to share those things. And so I am telling that story in part because I want to encourage us to be more active in those spaces, in all of our spaces, with the things that make up our identity, the experiences that we've had, the reasons why we do what we do, and to be a little bit risky with our trust, because we're going to find out readily who can be counted upon to remain in that circle and who can't. And there will be some who don't. There'll be people who opt out, and that's okay. One of my favorite quotes is Philo of Alexandria having said, "Be kind, for everyone you meet is fighting a great battle." That to me is the essence of the modern equivalent of Peter Drucker's "They're not employees, they're people." Those two quotes separated by probably 2,500 years or so. But that idea that we're all at our core human and having had human experiences. And so we show up to all of these different places and we try to put that away, especially when those things have recently been close to the surface. Whether they've happened recently or exist only in distant memory, they can still be close to the surface. And when those things are close to the surface, we are going to show up differently. And I, for my part, invite that. And I want that to be okay. I want that to be normal. And I want that to be something that we can benefit from, as opposed to feel like we need to minimize because of the discomfort it can sometimes cause. And of course, I'm not talking about turning all of our workplaces into offices of therapeutic help, but there is an element of friendship, camaraderie, being able to talk about real things that is important no matter what environment we're in. And this podcast obviously is mostly about work, but it's also about how to make the world better. And It doesn't take more than about 5 seconds of scrolling through any social media platform to understand that we need desperately some things that can unite us, because we are focused almost exclusively on the things that divide us. We're even manufacturing things that divide us at this point. And I don't need to list those things in some kind of rank order or even remind us what they are. We all know. And the first thing that goes away when we pay attention to those kinds of things, the first thing that goes away when we emphasize those things, when we pick sides, is the humanity of the other, whoever the other is. So whatever side of the argument we're on, the easy thing to do is to dehumanize the other side. And if we can dehumanize them, we don't even do this consciously. I think sometimes leaders do, which is both scary and also intolerable. But as soon as we dehumanize the other side, then we can treat them worse. We can dismiss their counter arguments. We can do a host of things that make it so that we feel better about what we think, what we believe, what our experience is, and minimize the experiences that they've had and what their positions are as a result. And constructive dialogue without humanizing the quote unquote other side is impossible. It's impossible. And my thinking is that if we start by things that are common to our humanity, we're all mortal. I did a TED Talk years ago that was called Lead Like They're Dying. And the premise of the talk was, we're all going to die. It sounds morbid, but we're all going to die. And so if we thought about that for a moment or two every day, the Stoics could call it memento mori, and just remember that you're going to die, in essence, that it would change the way we interact with people. It would change how we operate. And I think that's true in leadership as well. And if we take first our shared humanity in that space and the shared rites of passage that we have in our environments, in our communities, if we take the shared tragedies even that we experience, the loss of people we care about, whether that's familial or fraternal, and we want meaningful work and we want to have purpose in our day-to-day, that's another commonality that we have. If we can start with those things and make those things more normal, more readily available in terms of a conversation or creating presence or space for one another, then I am altruistic enough to think that can start to inform how we interact in other spaces where we don't agree, spaces where we have less in common, spaces where we have some point of contention or some big problem to solve and lots of different ways or ideas for what is the best way to solve it. And that doesn't happen at a macro level with nations and with the planet without it happening on a micro level with relationships and communities. And the more we segregate ourselves from one another, the more we insulate ourselves with the fences in our yards and the interests that we have and surrounding ourselves with people who have similar interests and similar perspectives, the less likely it is that any of those things will come to pass. And that discourages me. So I think there's a great amount of hope in sharing these kinds of stories and talking about why we show up certain ways. And I dislike the word trigger. I really do, for a host of reasons. Most of them are just me being me and facing things head on pretty much all the time. But I need to allow for the fact that there are things that are going to trigger us and trigger me. We had this conversation on my improv team in the not too distant past, because the theme of suicide and somebody pretending to die by suicide on stage, that's a trigger for me. When I watch that, it is always uncomfortable for me. I don't watch movies with that theme. I've never seen It's a Wonderful Life all the way through, because it's a theme I'm not comfortable with. And so those triggers are real. And it's a buzzword in our culture. And I know that's a space where a lot of people are going to disagree, but To me, the more we can talk about what those things are and then have that received well and say, okay, tell me more about why that is. And even if not, tell me more about why that is. I am willing to make space for that, even if I don't understand it. I am willing to go along with that just because it's better for you. And I'm happy to report, and not that it surprised me, but I'm happy to report that's exactly what happened with the improv team that I play on. I brought that up, and the people on the team went, yeah, of course. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I'm sorry. And that was a great feeling for me because I have friendships with those people. I enjoy their company. We talk about real things, and we play and act stupid a couple of times a month at an improv theater. But the environments that we find ourselves in and the relationships that we find ourselves in because of those environments are important. And do they bear the weight of the things that are really going on in our lives and the thoughts that we have and the experiences that we've had, and therefore how we show up in the world? And for me, the elaborate on this part of the story that I read to you a few minutes ago is I had those spaces when I was in college. I was given those spaces by people who cared about me, people who loved me. And if I hadn't had those spaces, I don't know what would have happened. And I was angry enough in those years and in the years prior that that could have taken me for sure. For sure. And so having those environments where people were willing to let me show up with all my broken pieces and the identity that I was still trying to cobble together and the sense that I was still trying to make of all my experiences was a healing event for me, a healing process for me over a course of years that made a big difference in my life. And I think we can do that for each other. And I think it matters if we do that in spaces where we come together for something other than that. So I had come to that place for education and found relationship and care and community. And we show up to work to accomplish something together, to have some common goal realized. And there we can find, again, community, people willing to hold space for us, care, even love. And I think that's true in any place where people gather. And so that's why I tell the story. And that's why we take a little bit of a tangent this week on the Insubordinate podcast. And I think in some ways it is an insubordinate thing to do, to say, hey, you know what? I'm going to bring my whole self to this space, whatever this space is. Because there are going to be people who probably tell you don't do that because it gets a little messy sometimes and it gets a little difficult sometimes. And we all have to grow when someone does that, because we have to wade into the part of that makes us feel a measure of discomfort. And why is that? And then we have to decide whether we're going to opt in or opt out. But I hope that what hearing these thoughts prompts for you is, where have you had critical experiences? And what have those critical experiences shaped you into? What are the points of your identity? What are the patterns of thinking, maybe both healthy and unhealthy, that you have carried over time that have you showing up in all of the different areas that are important to you, family, community, workplace, that maybe are worth framing, maybe are worth examining, maybe are worth reconsidering. Maybe some of those patterns aren't that healthy and they're worth thinking about, how do we do them a little differently? And maybe some of those are really good and are encouraging as you think about them, and that you have been able to, over time, grow and mature and express those in ways that have been able to benefit not only you, but other people. I hope that's true, but we don't know until we've examined that. And so part of my motivation in talking about these things and in giving you a part of my story is to invite you to do something similar in your own spaces and in your own world, and to have that measure of courage to create that in the spaces you occupy, and to show up with those and then invite other people to do more of the same, because better world really does depend on it from my perspective. So I would love to hear from you if any of this resonates with you, or if you have specific questions or thoughts. Some of the most popular episodes on this podcast have been those where I've shared a little bit more personally, and I've heard from people after that, and it's been really gratifying to hear that there are folks out there who are impacted and who have been thinking about some of these things because I've been able to say them out loud on a video or on a podcast. And so I invite you to do that. There's a feature, at least on Buzzsprout, where I host the podcast, where you can push the button and it'll actually allow you to text. I'm pretty sure my email's in the show notes, but Google, I'm easy to find. So I'd love to hear from you if any part of this is for you. And again, even though this isn't a face-to-face conversation, this isn't you and me in a room together, I would welcome that where that possibility can exist. And I hope that you have felt like this is a environment, virtual though it is, where your story is welcome also. And I hope that you will be well in the meantime. Until next time, stay with the program.